Hello, good day. I hope that you're doing fine. And as of now, we will move on to our major lesson, which is the philosophical stance and core tenets of the grounded theory. After discussing the qualitative research, that an introduction to qualitative research, let's move on to another level of understanding in doing qualitative research. But this video is designed to explain a certain philosophical stance when you conduct a qualitative research, at the same time focusing on the core tenets of grounded theory, or the core or the differentiator of how of grounded theory as a qualitative methods. So let me start with this one. Oh, let me move myself. Okay, so this one, let's start with how will we differentiate between methods and methodology, and at the same time the philosophical stance that I'm referring on at the intro part. So we will start with the method, although basically the deeper side of this discussion was supposed to start at the philosophical level, but I think you can relate more on the methods part. So we will start with the methods. So we have a little difference between methods, which is a procedure used to generate and analyze data. So meaning methods are particularly designed on how you will gather data and at the same time analyze it. So when you say methods of my research, that means you are referring to the process, how you gather the data, including data, of course, the data gathering process, and at the same time, how you intend to analyze or how you analyze the data gathered. So when you discuss a part of your research on that area, you are actually pertaining to, you are actually focusing on the method part. On the other hand, the methodology are the set of principles and ideas that inform the design of a research study. That means the overall research, chapter 3 or your methodology is particularly focused on the overall design or approach on how you will conduct research. And methodology part is, so here, the methodology is actually a set of principles, and it packaged the entire methodology usually in your chapter 3 of the proposal. But we also term this sometimes at research approach. What would be the overall approach of your research, which already included within it is are the methods, or your the method part. The last part would be the philosophical stance. This is your role as a researcher as you influence your research result. Unlike quantitative research, where normally the researcher objectively try to understand the phenomenon, in the qualitative research is we try to set ourselves as part of the instrument, meaning you might be the instrument of the research rather than the survey. So that means you have some influence on how you analyze the data. So in qualitative research, we're advised also to define whether your philosophical stance is your distance between the participants, meaning you will not include yourself as part of a greater, or as part of the result, or you acknowledge your inclusion or involvement within the presentation or the side or perspective that you have, meaning you normally qualitative research is judged as subjective part, but sometimes there are principles that we try to be objective as much as possible. So there are strategies, although we have limited strategies on how to define our biases and distance ourselves with the result of the study. So because qualitative data are usually perceived as subjective by nature, there is a need sometimes to include a philosophical stance within your chapter 3. So if you look at the the relationship or the intersection of the various parts of your chapter 3. When you do qualitative research, you're advised to put your political stance and provide an approach of your methodology and the specific method that you will be used to be able to prove or to justify the result or the conclusion later or your hypothesis. Um, Although in grounded theory, just a comment or additional information. In grounded theory, we don't usually, if you have, we don't usually put a philosophical stance, depending on which grounded theory strand you are actually following. So for instance, on my part, I avoid putting a philosophical stance during my dissertation because although these are subjective, but we are studying, we are a progressive theory, meaning we are looking at the progression or the process of the theory, which means that it might be a preliminary theory and not the theory itself. And we only define philosophical stance if you are very confident that your theory is actually derived in that particular stance, except for your strand. We are using a classic grounded theory, so the philosophical stance for grounded theory is not actually defined on the classic side, although we have a recent philosophical stance as defined by Sharmas as one of the major authors that influenced the grounded theory methodology recently, and in its constructivist grounded theory as opposed to Strauss and Glaser, which are the earlier influencers of grounded theory. So, okay, so let me discuss a little bit about the next part. The next part would be the philosophical position or the what we call it, the philosophical stance before or the philosophy behind you as a researcher. So here is all research is interpretive. It is guided by the researcher's set of beliefs and feelings about the world and how it should be understood and studied. Some beliefs may be taken for granted, invisible, only assumed, whereas others are highly problematic and controversial. This is already part of this paragraph are actually extracted exactly in the readings on the essentials of grounded theory. So this will somehow guide us that there is a biases within the research, especially that we are in that they define research as interpretive, that somehow there is a subjective part of it. To defend the objective part of the quantitative research, for instance, since we have discussion before about quantitative research, the interpretation of the result can be subjective part based on objective data. But if you will check also, quantitative research limits the interpretation of data. For instance, you will force your participants to answer yes or no, or to classify their feelings in one or perceptions in 1 to 5 numbers, which has maybe a range of values. But in reality, the perception of the individual or your participants cannot be exactly described based on that numbers. Our varied opinion on something cannot be defined on cannot necessarily be defined on numbers 1 to 5. We have varied perception about things, but quantitative research forced you to choose among those numbers so that they can quantify the overall population. As I've said, the qualitative research try to define as many variations as possible, although for simplicity's sake, we also limit those variation. But the emphasis of qualitative research is more on variation, or shall we say the outlier among things that we have observed in common phenomenon in a given context.